The hall was filled with golden light and the soft hum of cameras. A global humanitarian film event was happening in London, where the world's most inspiring figures had gathered to celebrate silent kindness. Among them sat Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, side by side, both calm and graceful. They were not there as movie stars, but as two people who had spent years helping others quietly without making noise about it. The audience waited, their eyes fixed on the stage as the host smiled and began to ask questions. When the host turned to Sandra and said, "What inspired your kindness?" something inside her changed. Her smile faded slowly, her eyes lowered, and her fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. The audience expected an easy answer, maybe a story about her career or her fans, but what came next would silence the room. For a few seconds, Sandra said nothing. The lights reflected softly on her face as she blinked, holding back tears. Keanu looked at her with quiet concern, his expression calm yet protective. The host waited, unsure if he should speak again. Then Sandra whispered softly, "It started when I had nothing." The entire hall went silent. She took a slow breath and began to speak again. "Many years ago, when I was just a little girl, my family lost our home. My mother was sick, and we had nowhere to go. It was winter, cold and dark. We spent one night walking the streets trying to find help. Every door we knocked on was closed." Her voice trembled slightly, and Keanu's hand rested gently on her arm, offering quiet strength. She continued, "Finally, a small shelter worker let us in. He was an old man with warm eyes and a soft voice. He gave us soup and blankets and told me something that never left me. He said, 'Kindness needs no reason, only timing.' I never saw him again. But those words became the reason I try to help others today." A hush spread across the hall. The audience was still. Even the camera crew seemed frozen in place. Sandra smiled weakly through her tears and added, "That man didn't just give us food. He gave me hope. And I promised myself that one day I would pass that hope forward." Keanu listened in silence, his eyes full of respect. There was something in his expression, something deep and hidden, as if her story had reached a part of him long forgotten. When Sandra finished, the audience rose in quiet applause, not loud or wild, but slow and heartfelt. It was not applause for fame. It was applause for humanity. After the session ended, Sandra walked backstage to sit alone. She stared at her hands, remembering that night, the smell of old soup, the sound of the rain outside the shelter, and the gentle voice that told her those words. Keanu entered quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her and sat beside her on the steps. Neither spoke for a moment. Silence filled the room like soft music. After a while, Keanu asked gently, "Do you remember where that shelter was?" Sandra looked up, surprised. "In Vancouver," she said softly, "near the old church on Granville Street, but it was torn down years ago." Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes dark with thought. "And you never knew the man's name?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "I was too young. I only remember his voice and his hands. He wore a silver ring that looked like it was handmade." Keanu's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. His breathing grew slower. Sandra noticed but said nothing. His mind seemed far away, lost in a memory he didn't want to disturb. She smiled softly and said, "You look like you're thinking of something." Keanu looked at her, his eyes calm but heavy. "Just thinking about how small moments can shape a lifetime," he said. "Maybe one act of kindness can connect people in ways we can't see," Sandra nodded. "Maybe that's the point," she said. "That we never truly lose the people who were kind to us. Their kindness lives on through what we do." A quiet breeze blew through the open door behind them, and the sound of laughter from the hallway drifted in. Keanu turned to her and smiled faintly. "You know," he said, "you always talk about kindness like it's a language." She laughed softly through her tears. "Because it is," she replied, "and it's one everyone can understand." As the night went on, the event hall slowly emptied. Yet something unspoken hung between them. Sandra didn't know that her story had touched something deep in Keanu's heart, something connected to his own past. He sat beside her, remembering his father, a man he hadn't spoken about in years, a man who had once said the exact same words, "Kindness needs no reason, only timing." Keanu stayed silent, unsure if it was just coincidence or fate. His mind filled with fragments of an old memory, of his father volunteering at a small shelter, of the sound of rain against tin roofs, and of an old silver ring shining under the light. He didn't say a word, but his heart whispered something he wasn't ready to share yet. That night, when Sandra left, she thanked him for staying beside her. He nodded quietly, his eyes gentle. "You're strong," he said softly, "and sometimes strength is just another form of kindness." As she walked away, Keanu stayed alone in the empty hall. He looked down at his hand, and on his finger was a simple silver ring, old, scratched, and shaped exactly like the one Sandra had described. His heart skipped a beat. He stared at it frozen. Memories began to surface like waves breaking through calm water. The night his father came home with bruised hands from the shelter. The day he said he helped a young family who reminded him of hope. Keanu's chest tightened as he realized what it meant. He whispered to himself, "It can't be." Outside, the city lights flickered in the mist, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Keanu closed his eyes, holding his father's ring tightly, unsure if the truth would bring comfort or pain. But one thing was certain. Sandra's story was not just hers. It was theirs, connected by an unseen thread of kindness that neither of them had yet fully discovered. And that was only the beginning. The next morning, London was covered in a gentle fog. The golden lights of the city glowed through the mist as Sandra Bullock sat by her hotel window, still thinking about last night's event. The applause, the tears, the silence after her story. It all replayed in her mind. She felt lighter somehow, as if speaking about her past had opened a door she had kept closed for years. Yet deep inside, something still felt unfinished. She made herself a cup of tea and opened her notebook. On the first page, she wrote the same words that the old man had once told her. "Kindness needs no reason, only timing." She smiled softly at the phrase, tracing it with her fingers. She wanted to remember it forever. But before she could write more, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, the hotel staff handed her a small envelope. It had no name, no return address, just her room number written neatly in blue ink. Curious, she opened it. Inside was an old photograph, a picture of a small wooden shelter with a church bell in the background. She gasped as she recognized it instantly. It was the same place where her family had stayed that cold night many years ago. Beneath the photo were a few handwritten words. "Some kindness travels farther than we ever know." Her hands trembled. She looked around the hallway but saw no one. The corridor was empty. She sat down slowly, staring at the photograph, wondering who could have sent it. The photo looked old, faded at the corners, and clearly printed years ago. But how had it found her? And why now, after so many years? Her mind filled with questions, but one face kept appearing. Keanu's. Later that afternoon, she met Keanu for coffee near the riverside. He looked calm as always, but his eyes carried the same quiet depth. She placed the envelope on the table between them and said softly, "This came to my room this morning." He looked at the photograph carefully. When he saw the shelter, his jaw tightened slightly. For a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even pain, but he quickly masked it with a faint smile. "That's the place you told me about," he said quietly. Sandra nodded. "Yes, but there's no name, no clue. I don't understand how anyone could even know about it. I never mentioned it publicly before last night." Keanu sipped his coffee, his thoughts deep. "Maybe someone from the event heard you and wanted to send you a memory," he suggested gently, though even as he said it, he didn't sound sure. Sandra leaned forward. The note said something strange. It said, "Some kindness travels farther than we ever know." Doesn't that sound like something someone close to the story would say? Keanu looked away toward the river. His reflection shimmered in the water. "Yes," he whispered almost to himself. "It does." They sat in silence for a while. Sandra studied him, sensing that he was hiding something. There was a weight in his eyes, as if he knew more than he wanted to say. She decided not to push him. Instead, she smiled softly and said, "Whatever it means, maybe it's a sign that I should find out who that man was." Keanu nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Sometimes the universe wants us to close the circles we left open. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. She spread the photograph on the table and opened her laptop. She searched for archives about old shelters and churches in Vancouver. Most of the results were gone or buried under time. But after hours of searching, she found a news clipping from nearly 30 years ago. It mentioned a volunteer program run by a small shelter named Hope Haven. The article listed a few volunteers. One of them was named Sam Reeves. Her heart skipped a beat. Reeves. The name stayed in her mind as she whispered it softly to herself. Reeves! It couldn't be, she thought. Maybe it was a coincidence. The next morning, she called Keanu. Her voice was hesitant. Keanu, can we talk? He answered quietly. I was about to call you too. They met again, this time at a small park away from the crowd. Sandra brought the printed article. She handed it to him without saying a word. Keanu took one look at it and his face went pale. His fingers tightened around the paper. Sandra watched him carefully. Keanu, do you know this man? He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the ground, his expression torn between disbelief and emotion. Finally, he whispered, yes. That was my father. Sandra froze. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her heart began to race. Your father? She repeated softly. Keanu nodded slowly. Sam Reeves. He used to volunteer at shelters when I was young. He disappeared from my life when I was a teenager. I thought he had left for good, but I recently found some of his old journals. He wrote about helping a mother and daughter one stormy night in Vancouver. He never said who they were. He just wrote, they reminded me of hope. Sandra felt tears rising. Keanu, that was us. The words hung in the air like something sacred. Neither spoke. The world around them seemed to go still. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and a soft wind brushed through the trees. Keanu's voice broke the silence. He died years ago, he said quietly. But before he passed, he sent me this ring. He lifted his hand, showing the simple silver ring on his finger, the same one Sandra remembered. She covered her mouth, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. I can't believe this, she whispered. Your father was the man who gave me hope. The one who told me those words. Keanu looked at her with gentle eyes. Maybe that's why your story hit me so deeply last night. Maybe I felt it without knowing why. Tears streamed down her face, and Keanu reached out, holding her hands gently. You see, he said softly, kindness doesn't end when a person is gone. It just finds new hands. Sandra squeezed his hand, her heart full of emotion. And it found yours, she said quietly. You've carried it all this time. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I wanted to listen to your story so badly. Maybe I was meant to. The sun broke through the clouds then, spilling golden light over the park. They sat together in silence, both lost in thoughts of the past, of the man who had unknowingly tied their lives together. For Sandra, it was a moment of peace. For Keanu, it was the beginning of something even deeper, a mission to honor the kindness his father left behind. He looked at Sandra and said softly, maybe we can find that place again. Rebuild it. Not for fame, not for film, but for what it meant to both of us. She nodded through her tears. Let's do it. Let's bring back the house of silent kindness. And in that single promise, 2 lives became one story, a story born from pain, healed by compassion, and carried by love. The decision to rebuild the old shelter became more than a plan. It felt like a calling. Both Sandra and Keanu knew it wouldn't be easy, but something deep inside told them it was meant to happen. They agreed to start immediately, flying together to Vancouver, the city where their pasts had quietly crossed decades ago. The flight was quiet. Sandra sat by the window watching the clouds drift below. Keanu was beside her, reading through old notes he had brought, his father's journal, filled with sketches, scribbled names, and short reflections on kindness. He looked at a page marked with an old fold. Written in faint pencil were the words, "Hope lives where hands do good." Beneath it, a small drawing showed the outline of a tiny church with a bell and the word Haven underlined twice. Sandra noticed the page and said softly, "He really believed in it, didn't he?" Keanu nodded. He didn't have much, but he always said that kindness was the only thing you could give without losing anything. She smiled gently. Your father sounds like someone the world should have known. Keanu looked out the window, lost in thought. Maybe now they will, he said quietly. When they landed in Vancouver, the air felt fresh, filled with the scent of rain. They rented a car and began driving through the old neighborhoods. Sandra hadn't been there since childhood, but she remembered the narrow roads, the smell of wet wood, and the faint sound of bells echoing on quiet nights. They stopped at a small local library to look through records. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, smiled when she saw them. You're looking for something old, aren't you? She asked. Sandra nodded. A shelter called Hope Haven. It was near a church, maybe 30 years ago. The woman's eyes lit up. Hope Haven, she repeated. Yes, I remember it. My brother volunteered there once. It closed down after a fire. Such a tragedy. A fire? Keanu asked quickly. The woman nodded sadly. Yes. Many volunteers tried to save it, but the building was destroyed. The church next door survived, though. St. Bridget's, it's still there, but mostly abandoned now. Sandra's heart raced. Can you tell us where it is? The woman scribbled an address on a small card and handed it to her. You'll find it near the old bridge across the East River. But be careful. The place hasn't been touched in years. As they drove through the winding roads, the fog thickened. Sandra stared out the window, and every corner felt like a memory waiting to be touched. Finally, the car stopped in front of a small hill. There it stood, the remains of the old church, its walls cracked and covered in ivy, its bell tower leaning slightly to one side. Beside it, the burned skeleton of a building barely stood, surrounded by tall grass. Sandra stepped out slowly. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "This is it." Keanu followed, holding a small flashlight. They walked closer. Old wooden beams and broken stones lay scattered, but a faint sign still clung to a charred wall. The word Haven barely visible through the ash stains. Sandra kneeled beside the broken foundation, running her fingers over the stones. I remember this door, she said softly. I stood right here when he opened it for us. Keanu looked around, his flashlight catching on something metallic under the dirt. He knelt down and brushed away the soil. It was a rusted nameplate, half buried, with faded letters, Sam Reeves, volunteer. His breath caught in his throat. Sandra, he whispered, showing it to her. She froze. The nameplate glinted faintly in the fading light. Tears filled her eyes again. He really was here, she said in disbelief. He was here that night. Keanu's hands trembled slightly as he held the plate. It was as if he had just touched a piece of his father's soul. He helped you here, he said softly. And now we've found him here again. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound being the wind moving through the broken beams. The past and the present had merged into one place, a sacred space built by kindness and lost to time. As night began to fall, they lit a small candle in the church doorway. Sandra whispered a quiet prayer for his father. Keanu watched the flame flicker and said, He used to say the smallest light could warm the darkest night. Maybe he was talking about this. The next morning, they met with the town officials. Sandra explained that she wanted to rebuild the shelter in honor of all who had helped others quietly. Keanu offered to fund the restoration. Some of the officials were skeptical at first, unsure if it was possible or worth the cost. Then Sandra showed them the photograph and the nameplate. She said gently, This isn't about fame or charity. This is about memory. This is about giving hope back to a place that once gave it to us. Her words silenced the room. The mayor leaned forward and said, If you're serious, we'll support it. The land is yours to restore. Outside the building, Keanu smiled softly. It's happening, he said. Sandra nodded. Yes, but it's more than rebuilding a shelter. We're rebuilding his legacy. Your father's kindness changed my life. Now we'll make sure it keeps changing others, too. For weeks, they worked with local architects and volunteers. People began to hear their story. Not the celebrity version, but the human one. Soon, volunteers from across the city came forward to help. Old carpenters, students, retired teachers, and mothers brought food, supplies, and tools. Everyone wanted to be part of something that started with love. One evening, as the foundation was being rebuilt, a small girl approached Sandra. She handed her a note and ran away shyly. Sandra opened it. It said, "Thank you for giving our city back its hope." Sandra smiled, tears forming again. She looked at Keanu, who stood near the half-built doorway, holding the silver ring between his fingers. "He's still here," Keanu said softly. "I can feel him." She nodded. "So can I." As the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm glow over the new structure, they both knew that what they were building wasn't just a building. It was a promise. One born from pain, strengthened by time, and carried by love. The sound of hammers and laughter filled the air. The walls began to rise again, and every nail, every plank of wood, carried a story of kindness reborn. But deep inside the rubble, buried beneath the old floorboards, something still waited to be discovered. Something that would change everything once more. Weeks passed, and what had once been ruins slowly turned into hope again. The new shelter began to take shape on the same land where the old one once stood. Walls of warm wood replaced the charred beams. Wide windows let sunlight spill into every corner. Children from nearby neighborhoods came to help paint, their laughter echoing through the air like the sound of new beginnings. Sandra walked across the half-finished hall one morning, holding blueprints in her hand. Her clothes were speckled with paint, her hair tied loosely, her smile brighter than ever. She looked at the progress with quiet pride. The workers called her the Lady of Hope, though she never wanted a title. She said often, "This place belongs to everyone." Keanu was outside, speaking with a small group of volunteers. He wore a plain white shirt and carried boxes of supplies like everyone else. There was nothing of fame in his presence, only calm humility. When someone recognized him and tried to thank him for funding the project, he would always say softly, "Don't thank me. Thank the ones who came before us." As the day went on, the workers began clearing the last section of the old rubble near the back corner of the property. This was the part that had been most damaged in the fire. They wanted to lay a foundation for a small memorial wall to honor those who had served there before. While digging, one of the workers shouted, "Ma'am, you need to see this!" Sandra and Keanu rushed over. The worker held out something covered in dust, a small metal box, burnt on the sides but still sealed. The lock was rusted, but the engraving on top was still faintly visible. It read, "For the one who remembers kindness." Sandra's eyes widened. "That handwriting," she whispered. "It's his." Keanu looked at the box, his hands trembling slightly. "My father's." Everyone gathered quietly as Keanu gently pried the old lock open. Inside were a few folded papers, a faded photograph, and a small notebook. The papers were fragile, edges burnt but still readable. Sandra held one carefully as Keanu unfolded the notebook. The first page read, "If someone ever finds this, it means my work here is done." "But my message is not." Sandra read the next part aloud, her voice soft and emotional. "Years ago, I met a little girl and her mother who reminded me why kindness matters. That night, I learned that giving hope is not a duty. It's a gift that multiplies. I built this shelter not to be remembered, but so others could remember what it means to care." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, his heart aching with pride and sorrow. He turned the page where another note was written in smaller letters. "To my son, if you ever read this, know that I never left you. I carried you in every act of kindness I gave. One day you will meet someone who carries that same light. When you do, help them keep it burning." Sandra felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she looked at him. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew this would reach you." Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes glassy. "And he was right. I met you." The moment was sacred. No one spoke for a long time. The wind moved gently through the half-built walls, carrying the scent of earth and wood. It felt as though Sam Reeves himself was standing among them, smiling silently. Keanu lifted the photograph from the box. It showed his father standing outside the old shelter, his arm around a small child wrapped in a blanket. Sandra gasped softly. "That's me," she whispered. "That's the night we stayed here." Keanu looked at the photo and smiled faintly. "He kept it," he said. He never forgot you. They decided to place the box inside a glass case within the new building, calling it the Heart of Haven. It would serve as a symbol of how one small act of kindness could connect lives across time. As construction continued, the project gained global attention. News channels and social media began sharing their story, but Sandra and Keanu stayed away from interviews. They wanted the focus to remain on the message, not on them. They called the new place the House of Silent Kindness, and the name spread like warmth through a cold world. People from everywhere began donating, not just money, but time and effort. Someone sent blankets from Japan, another shipped books from Brazil. Letters arrived daily, filled with stories of small kindnesses inspired by their project. One evening, when most of the workers had gone home, Sandra found Keanu sitting alone inside the nearly finished hall. The lights were dim, the air quiet. He was holding his father's notebook, reading it again. She sat beside him without speaking. After a long silence, he said softly, "He always wanted to build something that would last longer than him." "Now he has," Sandra smiled gently. "Yes, and through you." Keanu looked at her and shook his head. "Through all of us," he said. "Through anyone who believes that kindness still matters." Outside, it began to rain lightly, just like the night Sandra first found the shelter all those years ago. They stood near the window, watching droplets hit the glass. She whispered, "Do you think he knows we found this place?" Keanu nodded slowly. "I think he never left it." A small laugh escaped her lips, mixed with a tear. "It feels like we're finishing his story." He turned to her with a faint smile. "No," he said softly. "We're starting ours." And as the rain kept falling, they watched the reflection of the new shelter lights glowing on the wet ground. It looked like hope reborn, shimmering between the past and the present. But just as they thought the story had given them all its answers, fate had one more message waiting, one hidden inside the notebook's final page, where a folded letter was tucked under the binding. The next morning, Keanu sat quietly at the wooden table inside the half-finished shelter. The workers had not yet arrived. The early light filled the room softly, touching the glass case that held his father's box. Something inside him urged him to open the notebook one last time. As he turned the last page, a folded letter slipped out and fell to the floor. He picked it up carefully. The paper was thin and yellowed with time. On the front, written in his father's handwriting, were the words, "For the girl who believed in kindness." Sandra entered just then, holding 2 cups of tea. When she saw the letter, her breath caught. Keanu handed it to her silently. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a message that made both of them fall completely silent. "Dear child," the letter read, "you may never remember my name, but I remember your smile. That night, you gave me hope as much as I gave you shelter. You reminded me that kindness is a circle. It comes back when we least expect it. If you ever return to this place, know that your light helped me rebuild mine." Tears rolled down Sandra's cheeks as she whispered, "He remembered." Keanu nodded softly. "He saw you as hope, not someone he helped." They both sat there quietly. The world outside hushed. Sandra placed the letter back in the box and said, "We'll keep it here forever. Not as a memory, but as a promise." Later that evening, the shelter's lights were switched on for the first time. Golden beams filled the hall, warm and peaceful. Volunteers gathered, clapping and cheering, but Keanu and Sandra stood near the doorway, watching quietly. Keanu looked at her and said softly, "My father built the first shelter with his hands. You built this one with your heart. Now it belongs to everyone who still believes in kindness." Sandra smiled through her tears. "And you carried both." The doors opened and people entered, families, children, and strangers who needed warmth. Laughter replaced silence. The House of Silent Kindness had come alive again, not as a monument, but as a living heartbeat of humanity. The grand opening day arrived under a clear blue sky. Sunlight poured over the new building, glinting off its golden sign that read, "The House of Silent Kindness." People from across the city gathered to see it, not as fans of 2 stars, but as witnesses to something rare, something human. Children carried small candles, volunteers held flowers, and soft music played in the background. Inside, Sandra walked slowly through the hall, touching each wall with gentle hands. She could still feel the echoes of her childhood footsteps in that same place. Keanu stood near the entrance, greeting guests with quiet humility. The air was filled with warmth, laughter, and the sound of new beginnings. When it was time for the ceremony, the mayor asked Sandra and Keanu to speak. Sandra stepped to the front. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "Many years ago," she began softly, "a stranger gave me shelter and hope when I needed it most. I never knew his name until recently. Today I stand here with his son, and together we have built this place not for fame or attention, but to remind the world that one act of kindness can last forever." The crowd grew still, some wiping tears quietly. Sandra paused, looking toward the glass case that held the letter and photograph. "This place is proof that kindness never disappears," she continued. "It waits. It finds us again when we least expect it." The audience rose in gentle applause, not loud or wild, but deep and emotional. When she stepped back, Keanu took her hand and joined her on stage. His voice was soft yet strong. "My father taught me that helping one person can change the world in ways you'll never see." He was right. His kindness reached beyond his life and found me through hers. He looked at Sandra with a faint smile. "And now it's our turn to pass it on." When the ceremony ended, people began lighting small candles in memory of all the silent helpers of the world. The hall shimmered with tiny lights reflecting softly on the wooden floor. The scent of flowers filled the air. Sandra stood watching, her eyes glistening. She whispered, "I wish he could see this." Keanu turned to her and said quietly, "He does." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sandra's emotions finally overcame her. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of peace. She covered her face, overwhelmed by the memories of her mother, the old shelter, and the man who had saved them both. Without saying a word, Keanu stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her. The crowd fell silent. The cameras paused. It was a simple hug, but it carried the weight of generations, a silent thank you between two souls connected by fate. Sandra's voice trembled as she whispered, "Your father gave me hope, and you gave it back." Keanu held her gently and said, "Then his kindness did what it was meant to do. It lived on." That moment became the heart of the entire story. The hug, quiet, honest, full of gratitude, said everything words could not. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about legacy, about how love and kindness never die. As the crowd began to light more candles, a child walked up to Sandra and handed her a small clay lamp with a note tied to it. The note read, "Thank you for making light from the dark." She smiled through her tears and placed the lamp beside the glass case. The hall glowed brighter, and Keanu whispered, "He'd be proud." Sandra looked at him, her voice soft. "He should be proud of you, too." The night ended with laughter and music. But deep inside that building, something timeless had been created. A home built not from bricks, but from kindness reborn. The next morning, as the first sunlight touched the windows of the house of silent kindness, a golden reflection shimmered across the room. It fell perfectly on the framed words above the door. Kindness needs no reason, only timing. And in that glow, it felt as if Sam Reeves himself was smiling, knowing his kindness had found its way home.